Hello, I'm Lori Geist, and I would like to start by thanking AbleNet and Deb Hofseth for the invitation to present today. I'm pleased for the opportunity to be here to talk about core vocabulary instruction. I'm on faculty at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I'll be representing work that our team at the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies has been engaged in, with the leadership of Karen Erickson, our director of the center. The importance of core vocabulary as a key support for individuals with communication disabilities has been supported by decades of research and clinical practice, but fully defining how to support teaching and use of core vocabulary continues to be an area of need. And this is especially true when we consider use of core vocabulary by individuals with significant cognitive disabilities. And today I'll share how our research at the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies is working to address this. And I'll talk about our work to develop a scalable model, a scalable implementation model, as part of a technology implementation project that's funded through the Department of Ed Office of Special Education Programs that's called Project Core. I need to offer the disclaimer that the work I'll be discussing is supported through current federal funding, but it should not be assumed that the views I share necessarily represent the positions or policies of the Department of Ed. And before we jump in, I did want to just mention, I see a hand raised. Deb Hofseth is on the line from AbleNet. And what we've talked about is capturing any questions that are raised during the session through the chat window in the lower left. And Deb will be keeping an eye on those. And as questions are answered throughout the session, we'll make sure that we provide time at the end that we can cover any unanswered questions, as well as if there's any difficulties hearing me or challenges in that regard, if you can enter that into the chat window, and Deb will be sure to alert me if we need to make any adjustments. I'd like to start by briefly mentioning that the project framing this work is a 5-year effort, and our team at the University of North Carolina and educators in partner schools are working side by side to develop and refine student-facing communication supports, as well as teacher, coach, and administrator-facing implementation tools. And in the end, our goal is to distribute everything we'll talk about for free through our Project Core website. And the implementation model that we'll be discussing is called the multi-tiered system for augmenting language, and it uses a universal core vocabulary. I'd like to take just a minute to get to know who you are with a quick poll on the primary role you play in the lives of students. So if you'll just take a minute and select the role that best describes you. Looks like we have responses coming in. Go ahead and take a quick look here. All right, fantastic. Looks like we have some nice diversity here. And your role may influence whether you are thinking about how to apply the information in your own teaching practices, or thinking about how the resources may support you as a consultant or instructional coach in classrooms. We're striving to create materials for this range of important roles that are represented here. The need for the work and instructional practices we're going to discuss today is best described by looking at some recent survey data representing a large sample of over 38,000 students with significant cognitive disabilities. And within this sample, 23% used aided AAC or sign language. And within this group, 70% of aided AAC users and 84% of sign language users used only single symbols or signs for a restricted range of purposes. 9% of the total sample were reported to have no symbolic system of communication. And within this group, 45% used conventional gestures, 15% used unconventional gestures, and 40% rather used reflexive rather than intentional behaviors. So there is a real need for us to support this group of students in getting on a path to symbolic communication that they can use in flexible ways with a variety of people on any topic they choose and for a range of purposes. There's an article in a recent issue of the AAC Journal that describes this study in more detail if you're interested. Okay, another quick poll here. Think about the students either in your classroom or on your caseload. How many of them need some form of augmentative and alternative communication? All right, we're all in good company, serving a significant number of students who need augmentative and alternative communication. A follow-up question you might ask yourself is how many of these students who need AAC have access to a reliable AAC system? Fundamental to this work is our belief that all individuals, regardless of the severity of their disability, have the basic right to ongoing instruction that will help them develop versatile communication skills. And related to this, we believe that teachers have the ability to acquire the knowledge, skills, and dispositions needed to help students with significant cognitive disabilities acquire versatile communication skills using a core vocabulary approach. We also believe in the importance of specialists like speech-language pathologists, assistive technology and AAC specialists, and related professionals. But the reality for this group of students is that 1 or 2 sessions a week with a specialist doesn't provide the intensity of instruction this group of students need, and that teachers have tremendous potential to provide the all-day opportunities to learn and practice these new communication skills. And this classroom-wide all-day instruction that we'll be discussing, in turn, allows related service providers like speech-language pathologists to build on these foundational skills and provide more specialized instruction. The intended outcomes of the work we'll talk about as improvements in student communication abilities and academic achievements. At the end of the day, that's what we're driving towards. Increases in frequency and quality of teacher use of a universal core vocabulary and other elements of the implementation model, the multi-tiered system for augmenting language, and the availability of this comprehensive implementation model to support use of the intervention and instructional practices. The multi-tiered system for augmenting language approach is informed by Marian Romsky and Rose Sevchek's system for augmenting language. The MSAL approach uses the system for augmenting language as a Tier 3 individualized intervention, but adds 2 additional tiers that are intended to offer more universal supports for the large number of students with significant cognitive disabilities who do not currently have a means of symbolic communication. Tier 1 focuses on the communication on the classroom and classroom teacher. It offers a universal approach to supporting symbolic communication learning and use through the universal core vocabulary. The second tier builds on the first by engaging speech-language pathologists and other team members in identifying additional specialized vocabulary that might promote more and continued student communication gains. We're going to focus today on Tier 1. Each tier includes 5 elements that are critical to successful implementation of MSAL. They are a well-organized AAC system, core vocabulary and symbols, use of natural, everyday environments for teaching, models of symbol use by partners, and ongoing resource support and feedback. generally speaking, core vocabulary refers to lists of words that are used frequently on a variety of topics and for a range of communication purposes. Estimates from a number of studies suggest that about 85% of what we say could be expressed with a few hundred words. And this is not to suggest that core vocabulary is all anyone needs. None of us would be happy if we could only say 85% of what we wanted to say. But the approach we'll talk about today focuses on core vocabulary as an important place to start classroom-wide. Core vocabulary primarily consists of pronouns, verbs, descriptors, and prepositions, and there tend to be very few nouns in core vocabulary lists. One more quick poll. How many of your students currently use core vocabulary in any form of communication, speech, sign, or graphic symbols? Okay, terrific. Okay, that's helpful. Helpful to know. And again, as we're moving through the material today, you might be thinking about those students that are using AAC but not yet using core vocabulary, and if there's some new ideas in terms of where this may fit. Our decision to emphasize core vocabulary at Tier 1 for this classroom-wide instruction is driven by the desire to maximize the usefulness of each word in order to take full advantage of natural opportunities for adults to model and support the use of the words. We have historically focused heavily on activity-specific and often concrete vocabulary for our students with severe disabilities, often creating overlays that depict all of the characters in the book or specific items used in an art activity. And our students were often successful using these types of supports in a relatively short period of time. But the usefulness of these words beyond the specific activity is often quite limited. And our assessment of usefulness here is tied to opportunities for students to communicate and for teachers to model. When I say teachers, it's the general teachers, everyone who's interacting with students in the classroom. Excuse me. Our focus on core vocabulary gives priority to this idea of maximizing opportunities for teaching and learning. As part of our Project Core work, we've defined a universal core vocabulary. The universal core vocabulary includes 36 words that were among the highest ranking on a list of words prioritized based on their usefulness for communicating in social and academic contexts. There's more information on the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies website related to this specific research. In addition to being highly ranked on this list, each word also met an additional criterion of being useful as a single word utterance. And this led to the exclusion of words like to, the, and is, and the inclusion of words like same, different, and all. And of course, we are working towards teaching our students to combine 2 or more words. But given the large number of students who are communicating at these early, in many cases pre-symbolic levels, and just getting started with symbols, we did not want the ability to combine to be a requirement to getting started. The words have been integrated into universal core vocabulary communication supports that display 4, 9, or all 36 words at a time for access through touch, eye gaze, or scanning. And given the importance for teachers and students to learn where words are located on individual systems, we've tried to organize each to support consistent placement relative to other symbols across the different displays. The different formats feature symbols of different sizes with and without color contrast. And we've created 3D symbols for many of the words to support students who are blind. And to support aided language input during group instruction, a poster-sized version was also designed. The universal core vocabulary has been programmed on a variety of voice output communication devices, and all of the current print-based universal core vocabulary supports are available for free download from the Project Core website. We've also recently added a decision-making tool that helps you determine which might be the best format to start with for each student based on your answers to a series of yes/no questions. 3D symbols are available to represent select core words, and we're using 3D printing, which provides consistency that has historically been difficult to achieve with previous approaches to developing tactile symbols, using our tools like glue guns and drawers full of materials. With 3D printing, once a symbol is designed, when it gets lost or damaged, as they almost always do, it can be recreated in the exact same way over and over again. 3D printing also allows us to create symbols with no small parts that could come off and present a choking hazard. Each symbol includes a unique raised element, the printed word, and Braille. Our approach is based on this central belief that everyone communicates, and it's our goal to identify how students are currently communicating, attribute meaning to and honor these behaviors, and support all students towards becoming more intentional symbolic communicators. We don't have any prerequisites for students getting started with the universal core. And while not all students will begin using the core words right away, early exposure through good models is critical to lay the foundation for this future success. The communication matrix is one of the primary tools for identifying and documenting students' communication abilities, both as a baseline assessment support and as an ongoing measure at points after the multi-tiered system for augmenting language and the universal core vocabulary has been introduced. Charity Rowland and her team at Oregon Health and Science University have been developing and refining this assessment through their research over the last 25+ years. And the matrix pinpoints how students are currently communicating to guide thinking about communication goals and intervention. And it's appropriate for students of all ages who are functioning at these earliest stages of communication. And it honors all forms of communication, including pre-symbolic behaviors. More specifically, the communication matrix is organized by behaviors at 7 levels of communication ability. The use of these behaviors are assessed across 4 basic reasons to communicate that include refusing things that aren't wanted, obtaining things that are, engaging in social interactions, and providing or seeking information. For each of these reasons to communicate, all of the behaviors a student uses are observed and recorded. At level 1, pre-intentional or reflexive behaviors are those that express a state like hunger or discomfort that are interpreted by the observer. At level 2, students demonstrate an intentional behavior, but these behaviors are not yet intentionally communicative, in that the student doesn't yet realize that they can use them to affect someone else's response. So things like facial expression and body movements that we observe and infer meaning. For example, when a student reaches towards something that they can't quite get without paying attention to you or others in the room who could help, this is an intentional behavior. That reaching behavior becomes a level 3 intentional communicative behavior when that student looks at you to say, I want that, can you help? And it's a level 4 behavior when the student uses a conventional gesture by pointing to it to communicate, I want that. It moves to level 5 when that student points to a picture of the desired item. And level 6 when the student points to an abstract symbol for words like want or get. and a level 7 behavior when the student puts 2 or more words together to say things like, I want, or you get, or get it. In our current partner schools for Project CORE, we have a number of students communicating at levels 1, 2, and 3. And we've included in the implementation model supports that assist teachers in identifying and attributing meaning to these behaviors to drive students toward intentional and symbolic communication. And we believe that these students, while perhaps not yet using the universal core expressively, will benefit from the teaching and modeling that's happening classroom-wide. To date, we've completed the communication matrix on more than 100 students across 25 classrooms. Again, many students with the most significant cognitive disabilities are beginning communicators. Some are able to use speech, signs, or symbols to communicate. Some are using unconventional forms of communication, and some do not yet intentionally communicate. We are including all of these students in Project CORE. We have no prerequisites to participation. All students communicate, and whatever forms they currently use should inform our teaching. We're not expecting students at these earliest stages of development to begin using symbols to communicate until we've provided thousands of learning opportunities through meaningful models of how to use symbols to communicate. And this is consistent with our expectations of typically developing kids who hear thousands and thousands of models of spoken language before we expect them to utter a single word. Students at these earliest stages of symbolic communication have need the same opportunities to learn through experiences of seeing others use symbols to communicate. So before students use speech, signs, or symbols to communicate, they move from pre-intentional to intentional forms of communication. And when students are pre-intentional communicators, communication partners must learn to observe recognizable expressions of frustration, sadness, happiness, and so on. And learning to observe these behaviors allows us to then build on them as we help students work toward intentional and then symbolic communication. As communication partners, we can watch for body movement that may be communicating something, and we can interpret facial expressions and use these behaviors to move students toward more intentional forms of communication. We need to tell the student very clearly what they did to communicate with us, helping them build understanding that they can influence how another person responds. Once students make that connection and begin to understand that they can influence how another person responds by using behaviors that communicate something, it really gets easier and easier to help them develop intentional and ultimately symbolic communication. So let's take a look at a few student examples. This is Harold, and an example of Harold's use of intentional symbolic communication relates to communicating for the purpose of requesting to go. And intentional behaviors Harold used to express this were physically wheeling himself in an effortful way while looking towards the door. And he did these things without the intent of influencing another person's behavior. So while they were intentional behaviors, they were not yet intentionally communicative. An example of an intentional communication behavior is when Harold started physically taking my hand and putting it on the back of his wheelchair and looking at the door, a very clear way to communicate that he wanted to go. And during times like this, we modeled the use of the graphic symbol for go while saying things like, I see you looking at the door. You are telling me you want to go. You can also tell me go while pointing to the symbol for go and saying the word go. Harold has now started using the spoken word go in addition to these other behaviors. This is Abigail. Abigail is an intentional communicator who is just getting started using symbolic communication. Abby uses her facial expressions, vocalizations, and physical movement to let you know when she's engaged and when she's had enough. And symbols have been used for many years in her education as part of forced choice activities. So I've observed Abigail when she's presented with two activity-based choices. Do you want the green paper or the yellow paper for your art project? And she'll immediately reach up and, without looking, grab one of the choices and hand it over. And during these interactions, Abigail is not communicating that she wants the green or yellow paper, but rather she's quite effectively communicating that she does not care and she wants you to go away. And she's learned from years of practice that you've got to make a choice to make the asking stop. So an initial goal is to teach Abigail the flexibility of universal core vocabulary to say what she wants, including powerful words for teens to refuse, words like stop, not like, and go. This is Wilson. When Wilson is interested in an activity, he will smile, vocalize, and move his body to respond to invitations to participate and express himself. He is intentionally communicating that he likes it and he wants to be involved. He is starting to use core symbols that are available on his lap tray with the clear intention of being engaged and learning without always knowing what each symbol represents. And again, we're not trying to test the identification of the symbols, but rather we're teaching how symbols work in meaningful contexts. His teacher is taking full advantage of this and is interested in being engaged, jumping on every opportunity. She says things like, you put your hand on turn. I think you're telling me you want to turn. It's your turn next, while she's pointing to the word turn. With many models and meaningful interactions like this, Wilson is beginning to use the universal core. Wilson's family is also using the universal core at home. They have a poster-sized system that everyone in the family uses to model. The teaching principles applied in the multi-tiered system for augmenting language can be summarized in this way. Invite and encourage, but do not require communication. When we require, we risk things shifting into testing versus teaching mode. Have the universal core with you and with the student at all times. Be patient, provide sufficient time for students to respond, and hold your point when modeling. Students need to see the point or otherwise experience it in order for it to count as a model. Attribute meaning to recognizable communication behaviors whenever possible. And related to this is trusting yourself to recognize these behaviors without turning the interaction into a check of your accuracy. So for example, when you recognize a student is smiling, trusting yourself to say, I see you smiling, you're telling me you like it, while pointing to the word like, versus, I see you smiling, are you telling me you like it? Yes or no? Do you like it? And I hope that difference comes through. Trusting yourself allows you to honor the behavior and model more conventional ways to say the same thing. And finally, this idea of using the universal core to model, repeat, and expand on the things our students are trying to say. We're not using practices like hand-over-hand assistance or testing students' ability to identify symbols. We're focused on providing opportunities for our students to communicate and really tuning in to how they are expressing themselves, which again, for many of our students is by using pre-symbolic behaviors like body movements and facial expressions. We're then honoring these behaviors and attributing meaning as we model more conventional ways to say the same thing using the universal core. So again, when we see a student reaching towards a desired item, we say things like, I see you reaching, you want it, while pointing to the word want. We're not requiring the student to then point to the symbol for want before honoring their expression and giving them the desired item. We're using it as a natural teaching opportunity to model. One of the areas of focus over the past 2 years, as we've worked in over 30 classrooms with teachers serving more than 200 students, is identifying what resources are needed to support students in modeling core vocabulary as a part of their daily and instructional routines. And this list presented here represents the types of activities for which we have available professional development modules, planning guides, and checklist supports. We also have an instructional planning guide that helps teachers plan how core vocabulary instruction can be integrated. And our goal is that the planning guide could serve as a model for thinking through core vocabulary instruction during other academic activities as well. The common instructional routines we've started with are shared reading, predictable chart writing, alphabet knowledge and phonological awareness activities, independent reading, and independent writing. We also have self-evaluation and observation checklists, and these are intended to guide teachers' self-assessment and reflection on using the universal core vocabulary during these common instructional routines, as well as a support for peers, coaches, and administrators' observations. The checklists and the planning guides are all available for download from our project website. We currently have 14 professional development modules that can be accessed for either self-directed independent study, or we have a comprehensive set of materials that can be used to facilitate group sessions on each topic. The materials in the facilitator materials include a detailed facilitator guide that have scripts to follow as needed, videos to present, and suggested group activities, along with all of the supporting materials and handouts. With the time remaining, I'd like to share some of our first-year preliminary data, keeping in mind that our primary goal for collecting this data was to inform the development and initial evaluation of the multi-tiered system for augmenting language implementation model. So I want to make clear that we are not trying to draw any big conclusions at this point or make generalizations, but rather simply describe in a meaningful context what we've observed in one partner school. So let's take a look at our descriptive data from, again, the first full year of our 5-year initiative. We have a range of professionals represented, but given our emphasis on implementation in the classroom, the majority of our participants are in the role of teacher or teaching assistant. In our year 1 school, teachers tended to have several years of experience with an average of 13 years, and teaching assistants tended to be earlier in their careers in the classroom with an average of 3.5 years. Our 71 students have a variety of primary disability classifications with students in preschool through grade 12. Participating students are racially and ethnically diverse, and we have more male than female students currently participating. First and foremost, Project CORE is designed to impact the communication skills of students with significant cognitive disabilities. As such, the most important outcome measure of the impact is the communication matrix. During our initial 2 years, members of our research team at the University of North Carolina have been completing the communication matrix on all student participants at the beginning and end of each year of participation. Moving into our next year, school-level teachers will be completing the matrix and using the profiles of students' ability to inform decisions. Before I share the group data related to the communication matrix from year one, I'd like to share a couple case examples of individual students. This is Neil. Neil has a very complicated body and has demonstrated his ability to reliably use symbolic communication for years by indicating yes by looking up or no by way of an absent response to partner-directed 20-question style interactions. And while it's very good and important that Neil has a reliable yes and no that doesn't require anything external, as you can imagine, this approach to all of his communication is quite limiting. Over the past year, Neil has gotten started with partner-assisted scanning using the Universal Core Vocabulary. And a few months ago, a colleague had an interaction with Neil that illustrates the importance of good communication partners. Neil came to school wearing a super cool camp t-shirt, and his communication partner acknowledged it. And Neil responded through body movements, and his partner invited him to take the lead by saying, "Do you want to tell me more about camp?" while pointing to the word more. Neil indicated yes by looking up, and Neil and his communication partner used partner-assisted scanning in his Universal Core Vocabulary book to continue to talk about camp. And ultimately, he shared that he wanted to go again. This is Troy. Troy is learning from good models and lots of opportunities to explore his core-based system with responsive communication partners. Troy is using voice output, and he's a guy who is motivated to explore it independently, benefiting from the voice output to learn what each location and symbol represents. He's super motivated to try it out, to see what kind of response he'll get from his communication partners. And again, these interactions are not always with a clear, I'm selecting this symbol with a specific intent, but rather the intent is to say, I'm interested in engaging with you. And given this, his classroom teachers are using that as a meaningful instructional opportunity. He also has a couple siblings who are very motivated to model the Universal Core Vocabulary. So his learning opportunities have extended to the home. One quick funny story that speaks to the power of responsive partners. As Troy was exploring his system a few months ago, he was repeatedly selecting the words she and it. So his teachers were hearing him say in rapid succession, she, it, she, it, she, it. And of course, everyone became very interested in what he had to say, and he found himself commanding the room in terms of engagement. And so it was a really nice example of responsive partners, albeit a bit of a stretch in terms of the flexibility of core vocabulary. When we look at the change in average levels on the communication matrix, comparing levels at the beginning of the year and levels at the end of the year, we see gains across all 4 reasons to communicate. And of important note here is that we had a significant number of students who were functioning at the earliest stages at level 1 and 2 and not yet using communication in intentionally communicative ways. And the gains we see here are encouraging to us in terms of the benefit of good models and early exposure to core vocabulary for students who are not yet using symbolic language. For the purpose of information exchange, the matrix requires communication abilities at level 4 or above. So we looked at the change for 15 of the 71 students who were communicating at level 4 or above at both pre and post-test. This table reflects the total number of students at each level. And again, we're encouraged by the shift we see in the number of students at these earliest levels at pre-test to higher levels at post. On average, as a research team, we observed each of the 17 participating classrooms 1 time per week. And we captured field notes and observation summaries. And we used those summaries to inform areas of need for future professional development. In year 1, we completed 141 participant observations in classrooms. And results suggest an increase in the number of times that teachers attributed meaning to student communication behaviors, from an average of 58% of observations at the beginning of the year to 84% of observations at the end. Their use of graphic symbols, from 60% to 94% of observations. And modeling, the use of core vocabulary during instruction and throughout the day, from 14% of observations in the beginning of the year to 81% of observations at the end. At the same time, there was also a dramatic increase in the frequency with which students had access to core vocabulary, from 14% of observations at the beginning of the year to 65% at the end. And actually, observations of students using symbols to communicate during instruction, we saw an increase from 37% to 87%. 87 across the school year. We also use pre-post self-assessments for students in our first year school to determine the impact of the implementation program on teacher perceptions of their readiness to meet the symbolic communication learning needs of their students. It was a 12-item assessment. Teachers' average scores increased, with the greatest change noted on the item, I understand how to use a core vocabulary approach with my students who need AAC, where 44% of teachers disagreed or strongly disagreed with this statement at pre-test, and all teachers either agreed or strongly agreed at post-test. Similarly, for the item, I feel comfortable and confident in my ability to use AAC with my students, 60% of teachers disagreed or were unsure or neutral about this statement at pretest, and 90% agreed or strongly agreed at post-test. We're wrapping up our second full year of Project Core, and our focus is on refining the multi-tiered system for augmenting language and the universal core vocabulary. We'll begin to pilot in 4 new schools in the fall. That will be moving us into years 3 and 4 of the project. And ultimately, we'll put our ability to disseminate to the test in 10 new schools in year 5. We're also planning to build and support a community of practice, and we'll distribute all of the resources through our project website, which is project-core.com. I'd like to invite you to visit the website and make use of the resources that are there. They will continue to change as we learn more. So we've noted a draft date on most as, again, kind of an iterative development research project. We're really committed to, as we continue to learn more, having that reflected in the tools and resources that we provide. We currently have available a project overview, all of the universal core vocabulary formats we've discussed with representation in picture communication symbols as well as symbol sticks, the 3D symbol files to download and either print to a 3D printer if you happen to be lucky enough to have one in your building, or print to a community-based 3D printer or an outside service. The selection tool for determining where to start. We have 14 professional development modules along with the instructional planning guides and checklists, and continuing to add to it with our conference presentations and publications, and a growing list of answers to frequently asked questions. This is the Project Core research team along with our contact information, and I appreciate you taking the time to join us today, and I think we have a few minutes remaining to cover any unanswered questions that came up. I also invite questions after the session through my email that's presented here. Where do we find the self-evaluations on Project Core? They are under the implementation. Let me just pull it up, and I could share that if we wanted to take a field trip. If you go to project-core.com and click on Implementation Resources, the self-evaluation and observation checklists are presented there for alphabet knowledge and phonological awareness activities, independent reading, independent writing, predictable chart writing, and shared reading observations. Any other questions before we close for today? So I see your raised hand.
I don't see any other questions. Oh, looks like we just had another question come in, Lori.
Okay. So we find a copy of the 36 core vocabulary icons/words. Yes, those are all available through the project-core.com website. And I'm just going to share my screen here. And I'll show you right where those are. I think it'll take just a minute to come up. And from the main page, if you click on Universal Core Vocabulary Communication Systems, this will provide access to all of the formats that I mentioned, as well as the Universal Core Selection Tool, which is a series of questions that will step you through making an initial selection of a format to get started with for each student. Not intended to replace comprehensive AAC evaluations, really intended to just help steer you towards, here's a universal core format that might be an appropriate starting point. So from the main page, access to the Universal Core Vocabulary Communication Supports, access to the professional development modules that I mentioned. Again, for each of the 14 modules, there's the option to move through the content in the self-directed format or access the facilitated module materials to facilitate a group session within your school or district. And again, we are interested in making sure that we've covered this range, recognizing that professional development needs to provide that flexibility in terms of where does it fit within the calendar, both in terms of our personal calendars and our school calendars. So each of the facilitated materials, again, includes a detailed facilitator guide and all of the supports for delivering that session. They each require about 30 to 60 minutes, both to move through independently or to facilitate. And then the presentations and publications and the implementation resources that I mentioned, the instructional planning guide, self-evaluation and observation checklist, and some initial supports for getting started with using 3D symbols. Pop back out to our meeting. Okay. I think if there are no other questions, I will close for today. Again, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to join this afternoon and learn more about Project Core and the instructional supports that we're working towards. I look forward to the opportunity to keep in